Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so getting into Batman Superman #1, right? The story of the Shazam Who Laughs. This is a really, really cool story because this fits in nicely with Scott Snyder's Dark Knight's Metal. Now, with Williamson, I don't really worry about making sure things fit into continuity, but there are writers where you do kind of worry about that, right? For those of you guys who are finishing Superman Unity Saga, which we'll actually do the second video, or I guess the first part of the conclusion, we'll do that today as well. Brian Michael Bendis just kind of yanks out an ending out of nowhere, or part of an ending out of nowhere, and is like, it's the day is saved, and it's kind of like, okay. But with Williamson, I never really worry about that. With a lot of writers, when they do tie-ins or they do like a follow-up to an event, they'll in turn like start crafting a story and change things, almost like they're genuinely aware of the original story, but never actually read it. And that's one of the things that I was, that there is pause to be concerned for. But again, with Williamson, we don't really worry about those kinds of things, right? I mean, the guy's an outstanding writer. The guy keeps everything in continuity. I definitely dig his work. And so what this does is it initially takes place in the dark multiverse itself, and it picks up basically with Superman. Now, of course, Superman is summoned to the Justice League Watchtower basically by Batman. And again, this works really, really well because when it comes to Batman and Superman, they're kind of the 1-2 punch of the comic book community, right? I mean, and when I say comic book community, I mean like in general, including Marvel, DC, like Valiant, the whole 9 yards. Like they are the 1-2 punch insofar as like they're the two guys, right? Like they're the two guys that you always call. When Batman and Superman team up, then you usually get spectacular stories out of it because it's brain and brawn. And so when this takes place, when Superman like actually gets out there, he gets into the Watchtower only to find that basically everybody's been killed. This is the cool thing, is because if you remember during the Batman Who Laughs one-shot comic, the tie-in to Dark Knight's Metal that gave us his origin story, this is what he did, right? We don't really know exactly how he did it. We just know he did. That he went through and essentially like killed all the members of the Justice League, right? So like Hawkman, Hawkgirl, and then you have like Martian Manhunter, and you've got Wonder Woman and the Flash and everybody, like they're all literally just dead. And when Superman had walked into the Watchtower, because of the fact that the whole place had been flooded with a kryptonite gas, he was immediately dying, right? Like it was immediately the end of him. Like this whole place is flooded with kryptonite gas. There's no way for you to get out of here. You're going to die. And so it's kind of a precursor to everything, right? Because we know that following this little bit of an introduction, that in turn, what he'd done is he had kidnapped Jonathan Kent and Lois Lane and then brought them to the Watchtower and then infected both Jonathan Kent and Superman with black kryptonite, which of course drove them insane, and they tore Lois Lane apart. And so it's kind of interesting because this was really done to incapacitate Superman. It didn't really lead to his immediate death, but like it was designed to incapacitate Superman and then turn him into his darker self by using black kryptonite. And the whole reason why the Batman Who Laughs did this was because he was kind of like, I was just curious what you would be like if you were like your darker self. Again, it's really twisted and it's really more screwed up. But what this does is it jumps to Earth Zero. Now, this is where the main story basically begins to pick up. And what you have here is Commissioner Gordon summoning Batman himself. Now, when he summons him, Batman also just sort of kind of talks, right? And Commissioner Gordon thinks he's talking to him, but Batman is basically running over everything that had happened since the events of Dark Knight's Metal. That after that story where it seemed like all the Dark Knights had basically been defeated, the Batman Who Laughs survived and then kind of started going through with this campaign to try to make Batman into his darker self, to kind of present this idea that Batman could only ever be happy if he basically gave in to his darker side, right? So very similar to the Killing Joke, right? The Joker's desire to show that all it takes is one bad day for a person to snap and become just like him. Now, of course, it didn't work for Batman. He ended up staying and becoming a good guy, I guess staying a good guy and staying his normal self, as we saw during the Batman Who Laughs parts 1 through 7 full story. But basically, he's running over all this and explaining it all to Superman. And that's kind of a funny thing here, is because you would expect that Superman would know all of this, right? I mean, we know that at the end of the Batman Who Laughs, that he's basically stuck in the basement of the Hall of Justice and he's being held prisoner there. But just because he's there doesn't mean that Batman explained everything to Superman. And it could be that Batman just took him there and threw him in, right? Because any member of the Justice League can access the Hall of Justice, right? I mean, they're part and parcel to the team. They can come and go as they please. And so it's a cool little bit of a thing here, because basically all this stuff is sort of explained to Superman insofar as like the danger of an alternate reality version where there's a Batman who has all of his intelligence and all the Joker's insanity and can use that to achieve whatever goal he wants. Now, the meat and potatoes for why it is that Commissioner Gordon summoned Batman here and really Superman by extension is because there's a little kid named Danny Miles that's gone missing, right? He's been missing for a little while. His parents are freaking out and it's, hey Batman, like we need it, to be sorted out. And Batman summoned Superman here to basically talk to him and to help him with this case. Now, one of the cool things about this is that this is actually the first time in the history of really since the New 52 that Superman has met Jim Gordon. It's a pretty awesome little moment to go on here. No, I'm just messing around. Somebody, somewhere out there, somebody is furiously typing away on their keyboard, like freaking out, like, no, that's not true. I found something Rob is wrong about. Yay! Like, it's interesting. I imagine there's somebody losing it right now. But the whole reason why Superman was summoned here by Batman is because this is kind of Williamson touching on Tower of Babel. And it's cool, right? He doesn't explicitly say it. And even in the aftermath of Tower of Babel, while it wasn't referenced all the time, like, the stage had basically been set. This idea that Batman had protocols to take out each member of the Justice League if they lost their mind and they went rogue. And that's kind of what Williamson hits on, right? Like, Batman literally asked Superman, do you have protocols on what would happen if I became evil? Like, if I lost my mind and decided to take everybody out, are there any protocols there? Like, do you have any way to make sure that I wouldn't use anything against you? And it's kind of a funny thing, because at the outset, you would think, well, yeah, I mean, Superman's protocol is to just punch Batman's head off, right? I mean, just like, it's like Mr. Sunday Movie said, like, all the ways Superman could kill Batman, right? Like do this thing and then kick his head off, like, or punch his head off, or like rip his head off, or something like that. Like, all the different ways to pull that off, which is actually a pretty amazing video. You guys should all go watch that. But the fact remains, is Batman sort of asking the question, what are you guys going to do if a time comes when, with all my knowledge and all my understanding of your weaknesses and your strengths, I basically go crazy and I decided to take all of you guys out? And the response to Superman really seems to be, we don't have one because we trust you. And that's cool and everything, but you always need to make sure that you have a plan, right? Like, members of the Justice League have to have that, because you're talking about people who are exceedingly powerful or capable in their own right. Batman's not really powerful. He doesn't really possess any powers, but between his intellect and all his knowledge on the members of the Justice League, he could bring them down quick, fast, and in a hurry. That was the nature of Tower of Babel, right? Like, all these different protocols that were set up to incapacitate each member of the League in case they went awry or whatever the case was. For Superman to kind of respond like that almost really seems naive. Like, what if the most intelligent member of your superhero team, and indeed probably one of the most intelligent members of the planet Earth, short of maybe Lex Luthor, basically were to turn into a villain with all his knowledge about you? You have no safeguard for that. Like, you have no way to protect yourself from that. That's how the Batman Who Laughs won, presumably, is because his whole league trusted him. And there's something to be said about trusting him, but there's also something to be saying about being foolish, about not really taking the steps you need to in order to make sure that you and yours are safe, right? Because more important than any individual in the Justice League is safeguarding the Earth itself and ensuring the League's survival. That supersedes everything, right? So you kind of have to make sure all that is set in stone. Now, when this happens, of course, they end up traveling down to this great big huge hole where it seems as though Danny Miles has basically gone to, or at least where it seems like a place where he would have been taken. And when they get there, of course, there's all these mech bots essentially that were brought in here by the Batman Who Laughs, and they're all taken out pretty easily. What this does is this leads into essentially like this big makeshift place where the Batman Who Laughs was operating out of. And it's not really even makeshift. I mean, it's built and designed pretty well. But when the Batman Who Laughs and the Grim Knight were functioning, that's what this is. And this is a cool thing because we never really saw the tried and true lair of the Batman Who Laughs, right? We never really saw the tried and true lair of where he worked out of. We know he did, and we saw little glimpses here and there, but it's cool to essentially see the whole thing, right? It's cool to see like this entire thing in terms of where he was functioning and what he was doing. But like all these different, you know, like batarang molds and all these different things, all these devices were designed for the purpose of having essentially remnants of the Batman Who Laughs serum, as well as things like green kryptonite to take out Superman. And so it's obvious the plan of the Batman Who Laughs was much grander than simply just incapacitating Batman. It would have put two queens on the chessboard, no pun intended, because what you would have had is a Batman Who Laughs who has all the intelligence of Batman and all the insanity of the Joker, who in turn brings the main DC Universe Batman over to his side. You've got two evil Batmen running around a universe. They would decimate all. Everybody would fall prey to them. And so what this does is it almost leads to a kind of game, right? There's this chessboard that's basically set up between the white and the black side, and the way the pieces are arranged, no side can move without the other winning, right? So like if the black side moves a piece, white wins. If white moves a piece, black wins, right? Just because of the way that the chess set is set up. And so as a result of this, it's kind of like, well, what if we move a piece? Like, let's just see what happens. And when they do, it ends up basically bringing this giant image of all the different members of the superhero community. When I say all, I mean all of them. Every single member of the superhero community. And the idea is they've all basically been Jokerized, meaning they're all a target for the Batman Who Laughs serum, right? To basically turn them all into villains. And so it's kind of cool because when that happens, suddenly the two of them are met by one of the crows of the Batman Who Laughs. Now, these crows were always ambiguous. And really, it wasn't even like Scott Snyder never really even gave us any indication of what they were. You know, when this story was initially announced, it was funny because I saw people who were complaining about the fact that like, why is Joshua Williamson changing these crows to be what they are, to make them into his own thing? But that's funny. Like, Snyder never told us what they were. The fan base assumed what they were and then took that assumption as fact. And so it's interesting, right? Because I mean, we do that all the time, but it's sort of intriguing there. And so the result is that we basically have this crow who, of course attacks Batman and then basically starts talking to the two of them and saying that like the Batman Who Laughs took this kid from his family and basically hit him with a batarang that turned him into the person that he is now, turned him into a crow. That he changed this kid into what he is, forced him to start wearing this costume, and basically like, you know, used him in the various missions that he had. And so where you have Superman who addresses this kid as Danny Miles, the kid says, you don't understand, I'm not Danny Miles. Like he took me, like the Batman Who Laughs took me from where I was and freed me. Like I'm not upset about where I am. I'm not sad about being where I am. I don't want to go back home. Like I'm free. Like do you guys not recognize me? My name's Billy Batson. And so this is crazy because what we get is the Shazam Who Laughs. And this is awesome because Billy in turn shouts the word Shazam and then basically like becomes this insane powerhouse and asks the question, I always wondered what it would be like to beat the crap out of Superman. And actually what he's got in his hand is to stab him with one of the Batman Who Laughs batarangs. This is amazing because like the notion of a Shazam Who Laughs, right? I mean, you know, Superman Who Laughs would be cool, but Shazam is a fan favorite. You guys love him. And so like you take like Shazam and then you turn him into basically like a Batman Who Laughs character. Oh, it's beast. It's amazing. Okay, so we're picking up with Batman Superman #2, which, oh my God, I've been dying for this comic to come out because like the first one was so good. It was amazing. I was like, what a way to intro it. Like, what a way to bring this in, like the Shazam Who Laughs. Now, here's the cool thing, and I think this is actually gonna prove to be one of the most important parts of this particular story arc that Joshua Williamson is writing. Initially, you pick up with Commissioner Gordon, right outside of Gotham City in the Gotham City Police Department armory. So while it is in the GCPD armory, it isn't usually normal for him to like kind of sneak off and meet with somebody outside the city for a particular purpose, right? And the fact that it is the armory means that, of course, it's police property, meaning Commissioner Gordon could go in there and basically dismiss everybody temporarily or find a place to meet in secret and basically talk to this person who really appears to be Catwoman more so than anything else. But he basically talks about the various forms of evidence and all the poisons and all the things that the various villains from Gotham City use that is all basically locked down by Wayne Tech security, right? So this seems to indicate that he's talking about the Batcave or some place basically controlled by Bruce Wayne. We could argue like Arkham Asylum, but it would make sense for Commissioner Gordon to be able to just go into Arkham, but there is also a lot of red tape, right? I mean, Commissioner Gordon isn't really like the warden of Arkham, so he couldn't just walk in there and take what he wants. He would need a warrant in order to be able to access that information. It looks like he's talking to Catwoman because he's basically saying like not even Commissioner Gordon has access to these things. It's impossible to get past except for this one particular person. And the reason why I say Catwoman is because she's like the greatest thief in all of Gotham City, right? And I would probably say probably the world. I mean, I don't think that DC's really broken down the level of thieves in terms of how they compare to everybody else, but nonetheless, at this point, it transitions to the actual fight between Shazam, Superman, and Batman. And this, I think, is really what you guys came to see. The fight between Shazam, Batman, and Superman. Now, this is the reason why this works so well, is because on the surface, if you're not really knowledgeable about like the weaknesses of Superman, on the surface, you would look at this and just kind of see it boil down to a fight between a Superman-esque character and Superman. But it's far more interesting than that, because remember, Superman has a weakness to magic, and that's one of the things, that's one of the I guess the upper hands that Shazam always sort of had on him. Now, Shazam's not a straight up magic wielder like, you know, like Zatanna or somebody like that, but magic is invoked in the powers that he uses, and so it's kind of cool to see Joshua Williamson sort of tug on that little string and then have him face off against Supes. And so with Batman being part of the fray, it's sort of funny here because it's just sort of like Batman's just a guy in a Halloween costume, right? Like Shazam Who Laughs doesn't really take him seriously, and indeed, there's no reason for him to. And so with that being said, like you basically end up having like the question of Batman of where's this thing being kept? Of course, he's essentially on the hunt for something, and it's a cool scenario because what ends up happening is Superman goes to use his heat vision on Shazam, and then Shazam turns back into Billy Batson. And this is genius here. This is absolutely genius. And here's the reason why. Shazam, I always sort of saw depicted as a young, naive kid who was an answer to the question, what if a teenager had the powers of Superman? That's really how I always saw him. And for the most part, that's really what he was. Like, what if you woke up one day and you had all of Superman's powers, but you had them on command? I want to be Superman now. And you basically got all those powers that the Man of Steel has. What would you do with that? I never saw him as the sharpest tool in the shed. I never saw him as very good at like trickery and deception or anything like that. And mostly because of the fact that the way he's been written over the years isn't really exactly like Superman. It's more so that he has other people who are smarter than him to basically kind of help him and aid him, right? So you got like the Wizard Shazam who can go to for guidance. In more recent years, you have the Shazam family. He even learns lessons from like Black Adam, who's exceedingly old and has a lot of like battle-hardened wisdom to sort of impart on Shazam, albeit by beating the crap out of him. So the fact remains that there are a lot of teachers in the world of Billy Batson, and so I never really saw him as a kid that needs to learn more than how to like defeat this particular foe. foe or to use his brain in some smaller fashion. What he does here is genius because he tricks the heck out of Superman. He's just like, dude, Superman, I'm sorry, man. I don't know what's going on. I get these weird visions and nightmares and things like that. You got to find a way to help me. And then it's just like messing around, got Superman to lower his guard, and then turns back into Bill. It turns it back into Shazam again, right? Like, this is genius. And this is one of the coolest things about bringing in characters from the dark multiverse, is it gives us iterations of the characters that we don't normally see. That while Billy Batson is by no means an idiot, he's certainly not like super good at like tricking people and using like espionage and subterfuge to get what it is that he wants. But doing that here is really, really, really smart. Like it's pretty awesome. And so what he ends up doing is basically sort of kind of revealing to Superman a bit of his intention. Now, in reality, it should kind of be taken with a grain of salt. And the reason why I say that is because what he does is basically saying that like, hey, you know, you always considered my existence to be a joke. You guys laugh at me and you guys talk about me behind my back, different things like that. Basically, like, you never really took me seriously. You had me on the team because I'm powerful, but not really because I matter. And the reality is that this is not Billy Batson from the main DC universe. This is Billy Batson from the dark multiverse. And so what he's basically doing is bringing all those ideologies from the dark multiverse into the main DC universe and then basically putting them onto Superman, right? Like projecting them onto Superman and saying like, how you guys existed in my universe is how you guys exist here, which is not necessarily true. But what it does do is allow him to maintain this fantasy of believing what he wants to believe. And so it's a really cool concept. And it's a really cool idea. It's a great reflection of people in the modern day. And so of course, then you have Batman who just comes flying in with like the Batman Who Laughs Batwing. Because remember, when the Batman Who Laughs came over from the dark multiverse, the first thing was being part of Dark Knight's metal. But following the defeat of Barbados, then it turned into, well, how can I basically bring down this Earth and turn it into like a dark multiverse version of itself? And so it wasn't really enough to say, hey, like, we're going to start injecting people with toxins. You basically had to have systems in place that could make him comparable to Batman. And with Batman having all these gadgets and things like that, the Batman Who Laughs had to have his own version of those. And so that's why you saw the Batman Who Laughs having things like his own Batwing and so on and so forth. It was a way to just kind of build his presence up and to allow himself to become a legitimate danger to Bruce Wayne. Because at the end of the day, why would Bruce Wayne be worried about himself running around on Earth who doesn't have a Batwing or a Batmobile or a Batboat or a Bat credit card? Like, why would he have to worry about that guy? He's just like, okay, so like, I'll just track him down and then shoot him in the face when he's like running away from me. And that would basically be it. But it's kind of a cool thing because what Batman does is basically roll up on Shazam and then in turn like stab him, right? Now what it does is it allows Shazam to essentially like incapacitate Batman, to send him flying down to the ground while he's unconscious and force Superman into a choice. Do you want to defeat me or do you want to save Batman? Now here's kind of a funny thing, and in reality, I would have defeated Shazam. Like, I want to know what would you guys have done? Would you guys have defeated Shazam or would you have saved Batman? Like, I'm kind of curious. It's like a video game choice, right? Like, what was it? Arkham City, where like you're Catwoman and you have to choose between like taking the money and leaving or like saving Batman. I live streamed that at one point and all you guys, like a bunch of you guys were watching it and I was like, what should I do? You guys were like, let Batman die. You guys are heartless. You're terrible people. Terrible people is what you are. But nonetheless, it's really cool here because I would have defeated Shazam. And the reason why is because Batman, you know, Bruce Wayne is very, very capable. That's true. And really like Dick Grayson and Tim Drake and Damian Wayne and Jason Todd if he chose to, and even Batgirl. Like, they're not really a Batman, right? They're not a perfect stand-in, but hey, they're good enough. So I would have been like, all right, you know, hey, sorry, Batman. It's been real and it's been good, but it ain't been real good because you're kind of a dick. So like, I'm going to defeat Shazam. Shazam's got to go. And then like, just go to Dick Grayson and say, man, it was terrible, man. Like, it was awful. You know, it's you know, it was a tough choice to make, man. But like, you want to be Batman though? Like, that's basically how it would go. That's basically how that whole situation would go down. And it's kind of funny because in turn, when Batman wakes up in the Fortress of Solitude, he actually starts chastising Superman and just being like, why didn't you stop Shazam? Why didn't you let me die? And indeed, it would have been the smarter move to make. Now, of course, Superman ends up doing the Superman thing where it's like, well, I looked into his eyes and I saw that it's really Billy Batson. He's just struggling with a few things. And it's like, look, we're not talking about drug addiction, right? Like, we're not talking about, you know, Shazam, you know, the Billy Batson got his heart broken by some girl he met in like the 9th grade and like he was never in love before and he couldn't get over it and he was just struggling forever and he decided the best way to do it was become some angsty teenager who's also an evil version of Superman, more or less. But that's not what we're talking about. Like, we're talking about a legitimately evil superhero out there who would further the plan of the Batman Who Laughs and turning the entirety of the world upside down. So it's kind of crazy because in doing this, and it's sort of taunting of Superman, what Shazam basically revealed to him is that the Batman Who Laughs is working with basically dark multiverse versions of themselves, right? So like the Superman who laughs and the Wonder Woman who laughs and the Aquaman who laughs and different things like that. What it does is it provides them with an end. And this is kind of the benefit of Superman, and it's why he did what he did, right? Because it's kind of like, okay, look, we could defeat Shazam who laughs, but at the end of the day, we're treating a symptom. We're not treating the cause. We need to actually treat the cause, right? So let the small fish go to catch the big fish. That's the cool thing that goes on here. And so we're basically, he sits down and analyzes these batarangs that were used by the Batman who laughs, and each one is basically encoded to the particular DNA sequence of each member of the Justice League and designed to infect them in a way that will basically allow complete and total control, right? So Superman being weak to kryptonite, the batarang was laced with some form of kryptonite, most likely, in order to basically pierce the body of Superman and then in turn infect him. The question is, where do we go from here? And that's when Batman and Superman form this plan. What they end up doing is basically traveling out, and Batman says, like, no one can know what we're doing here. This has to stay secret. Now, this is really the question that I had, is with a scenario like this, like a Shazam who laughs running around out there, how does the Justice League not get involved? And it's basically Batman telling Superman, like, no one can know what we're doing. This has to be a secret mission between the two of us. No one can be aware of what's going on. And then he asks the question, are you truly ready for this? And the response of Superman is, one, I always knew that you had the Batman who laughs being held underneath the Hall of Justice because I'm a journalist. Now in reality, it could have also been like, I just used X-ray vision because I was bored one day and I wanted to see if anything needed to be cleaned, and then I just saw that the Batman who laughs is under there, and I was like, what in the heck is going on? Like, I mean, that would have been kind of cool. That would have been pretty interesting too. But nonetheless, Superman figured it out very, very fast, and he basically says it's the only real option that we have. And so this is what's really cool here, is because suddenly you switch over to the Batman who laughs, and when that happens, like, in comes Superman as the Superman who laughs, and the Batman who laughs greets him as an old friend, which is crazy. Because here's the question I have: is this actually the Superman, like Superman who's fine and pretending to be the Batman who laughs, or is it Superman who is like the Superman who laughs, right? Like, is that really what's going on? I imagine it's probably him faking it, but it'd be awesome if it wasn't. This entire time, it was actually the Superman who laughs who was pretending. And like Billy Batson transforming into the normal version of himself is Joshua Williamson's way of telling us that would be awesome. Okay, so we are getting back into Batman Superman. Like, we're getting back into Batman Superman. In the last video, we basically ended that on like Superman busting into the prison beneath the Hall of Justice where the Batman who laughs is being held, and then in turn, like, breaking him out, right? And so the big question, this is kind of the question that we ended this on, is it Superman full on infected, or is it Superman working on behalf of Batman? And the circumstances lent themselves to the idea that Superman was working with Batman, and this was all just one great big ruse. And that's really what it turns out to be. Right? It really just turns out to be a circumstance where Superman infected himself with the Joker toxin in order to go underground, or I guess in order to infiltrate and to trick the Batman who laughs into believing that he has successfully been infected. And so basically, like, this prison break, or at least, breaking him out of this facility, is one of the worst case scenarios in a lot of ways, because what it means is the Batman who laughs is on the loose again. But the other half of this, and the reason why this is so interesting, is because of Superman playing a dangerous game. Now, it's one of these things where Superman's kind of like, okay, so like, we couldn't get the plan from Billy Batson, what's this plan? Like, what's the scheme that you have? And the way the Batman who laughs does this is kind of hilarious, right? Because I was reading through this and I was like, well, this is like one of the most grandiose schemes in the history of everything, right? Like, it's kind of an insane scheme, but at the same time, it sounds like it'd be nothing the Batman who laughs would do. Because what he says here is like, my scheme, my grand plan here is to infect all the superheroes of your world, and then like infect everybody in your multiverse, and then like destroy your multiverse. And it's just kind of like, really? That's your grand scheme? Like, that's your grand plan, is to wipe everything out of existence? And he actually ends up going as far as to like taunt Superman and be like, how like your mom felt when your world exploded? Well, that's how you're gonna feel. It's almost like he's toying with the Man of Steel. And the reason why is because as soon as Superman basically reveals the fact that he's not fully turned, right? He lets his temper get the better of him and starts tearing into the Batman who laughs. Ultimately, Batman jumps in with kryptonite and stops Superman. And that's when you find out they never broke out, right? Like, they never broke out of the facility. Like, they've been in there the entire time. That Superman just walked in there. And so this perception that like the Batman who laughs had been broken out, this belief that like he was on the loose again, that none of it was real. But here's the funny thing about this, is the Batman who laughs knew. It's kind of this revelation of like, hey, he knows what's going on, right? Like, that's why he's taunting you, that's why he's toying with you, that's why he's using you, is because like he knows that all of this is a ruse. Like, he knows that all of this is a trick. And so he leaves them one last clue. When they ask him like, who are the secret six that you infected, as if it's going to do anything, as if it's going to like help at all, as if it's going to help with anything. They end up asking him like, who are the secret six that you infected? infected, and the Batman Who Laughs is like, I'm not going to tell you guys who it is. Like, I'm not going to reveal all the names. I'll just tell you, like, I wouldn't shine their name in the sky with a light, you know, and right off the bat, Batman immediately figures out who this person is, right? So drop Superman in this giant facility where it'll basically bombard him with solar radiation, and it'll help to essentially, you know, get rid of the Joker toxin. Now, here's the thing about that, right? Like, the more I say that, the more I think about it this way. Here's the thing about that. If Superman was infected with the toxin of the Joker from the DC universe, right? Not even Batman Who Laughs, but the main DC universe, and he was cured of it, it would stand to reason the following, that Batman would use his intellect to figure out how to adopt a faster cure, to find a way to basically cleanse the Joker toxin from Superman as fast as possible. Plus, you know, yellow sunlight, you know. Now, I guess it really, I mean, the only other alternative besides that is to just like put Superman in a capsule and shoot him into the sun. The problem is, you know, I mean, he kind of needs him. And so basically racing over to Gotham City, this is one of the things I like about this, because Williamson does not ignore some of the stuff that happened in the Batman Who Laughs, right? Like, that's one of the things that you guys will see when it comes to different crossovers. Those of you guys who are new to comics, and people who have been around in comics for a long time will tell you this is true, and it is the bane of almost any comic book fan's existence, right? Like, it's the one thing we hate the most. Like, it's the one thing that people are pissed off about with Brian Michael Bendis, which rightfully so, because Bendis is writing Superman, that basically ignored everything that was done, or, you know, in Action Comics and Superman before him, which kind of sucks because it was some amazing storytelling. Like, fans were pissed, but still, you know, like, it's one of those things where writers will come along and they'll ignore the work before them. They'll ignore the previous work. And then, like, fans will kind of feel like they're left hanging, right? Because they're part of this, like, cohesive story, and then suddenly it just gets cut off. It pisses us off to no end, to be honest. is really what it is. But this basically picks up after the events, or at least it really ties into the conclusion of the Batman Who Laughs, because what we saw at the end of that story is that the person who was infected was Commissioner Gordon, and that Commissioner Gordon was in fact the first person in the main DC universe to be infected by the Batman Who Laughs, right? Like, I mean, I guess aside from Batman himself, you know, following that, like, Commissioner Gordon was the first one to be infected, and he's been infected the entire time. And you end up learning the whole thing was a ruse, right? When he was like, Batman, Superman, come help, some kid's been kidnapped, and, you know, we need to track him down. That none of that was real, that it was all basically just like this big scheme. That was part of the big scheme that was thought of by the Batman Who Laughs in order to put Batman and Superman, 1, to work together, 2, to get them to isolate themselves, and 3, like, to basically infect Billy Batson. And so it's solid insofar as Commissioner Gordon is probably a person that you wouldn't expect. Now, the big question to ask here is, why was Commissioner Gordon infected? Like, of all the people to infect, why Commissioner Gordon? Because what can he do, right? I mean, he can, like what can Commissioner Gordon do in this scenario that could really change the game, right? That could really put things in a circumstance where it would somehow, like, change the landscape, right? Like, why Commissioner Gordon? Because he's basically just a guy who's a cop. The cool thing about this comes in the form of Superman, who basically says, the Batman Who Laughs just wanted to prove he could infect your closest friend, that he could get to the people closest to you. But here's kind of the issue with that. Like, here's the issue that I have with that. And I don't mean for this to turn into like a great big huge criticism of the Batman and Superman, by no means. Like, I love this story to death. But here's one of the things that kind of strikes me as strange about that is that was basically already established, that like the Batman Who Laughs can hit you closest to home, right? That was the whole idea behind the entire Batman Who Laughs miniseries. Like, there's no safe place, right? Like, if he wants to come for you or the people you care about, he will, right? So that's already established. It may just be one of those things where Williamson is kind of establishing that for people who never read the Batman Who Laughs miniseries, which I don't know why you wouldn't. It's an amazing miniseries, but like anybody who didn't read that, kind of bringing that in. But what it does do is it basically says that like the individuals who are being infected by the Batman Who Laughs is being done for strategic purpose, right? So I don't think it's simply just because of the fact that it's Commissioner Gordon and he's a really good friend of Batman. I think there's other reasons behind this. I think there's a bigger motivation behind this in terms of why Commissioner Gordon was infected here. Now, here's the other cool thing that kind of comes out of this is you end up having like one of these mech suits that comes descending down onto Batman and Superman. Superman uses his frost breath and freezes it. Now, somebody here correct me if I'm wrong, and I may very well be, but somebody correct me if I'm wrong. We haven't seen Superman use his frost breath for quite some time, right? I wouldn't go as far as to make the statement and say that like he hasn't done it like in the entirety of New 52 or DC Rebirth. I'm not going to make that statement. I mean, honestly, I can't remember that far back, but I feel like we haven't seen him do it over the course of Rebirth. I mean, it's kind of cool to see, to be honest with you guys. Like, it's cool to see him use his frost breath. I don't know, maybe he used it recently. I'm not 100% sure. I don't remember him using it during Bendis' Unity Saga. I don't remember seeing him do it before Bendis took over on Batman or Superman. I don't remember seeing him do that. Like, I don't recall that. It's just kind of a cool little small thing to see. Jim Gordon's taken out pretty quickly, right? He's taken out quite swiftly. And that was the expectation, because what this does is it forces Batman to think differently. You know, his response here is, okay, if the Batman who laughs thinks like me, then it's time for me to stop thinking like me. And it's time for me to stop thinking like him, right? Because it creates a circular pattern. If Batman sits down and says, okay, so the Batman who laughs is basically me, I'm going to think like him, which is thinking like me, which is thinking like him, it creates a circular pattern where he never gets out of it. So it's like, let's nip that in the bud. Let's think like what Superman would do. What would the Superman do here? Like what would he do in this circumstance? And it's really kind of cool to see, because what it is it's Batman basically deferring to Superman's logic. It's Batman deferring to him and saying, okay, like one, we're going to take Commissioner Gordon to the Fortress of Solitude where nobody else can get in here, right? Where everything else will be fine. And then like, we'll go with what Superman would do here, because it's the Batman who laughs, not the Superman who laughs, right? So it's kind of a cool thing. The problem with this is that Commissioner Gordon was a Trojan horse. That's exactly what Commissioner Gordon was. Commissioner Gordon was designed to, was basically, that's the reason why he's here, is because he knew that Batman wouldn't kill him, right? The Batman who laughs knew that Bruce Wayne would not kill Commissioner Gordon. He's going to take Commissioner Gordon to a place where he believes the Batman who laughs can't get to him, which would be the Fortress of Solitude, right? Because the only people who can get in there are people who are explicitly given access by Superman, right? You can't just have any swinging dick walking up to the Fortress of Solitude and just being like, open sesame, and then like it opens up and they walk in. Otherwise, what would be the purpose of calling it a fortress? It'd just be like, you know, a giant place in Solitude is what it would be called. Like, you know, a relatively well hidden location in Solitude. That'd kind of be what you would have to call it. The idea here is that with that being the case, with the Batman who laughs knowing that and knowing Bruce would make that move, that leads to him bringing Commissioner Gordon to the Fortress of Solitude, which in turn basically brings out Jaime Reyes. Now here's the thing, all right, here's the interesting thing about this. I feel like Jaime Reyes fans are probably gonna like hit the roof and be insanely happy, and rightfully so, right? Because here's the thing about Jaime Reyes. Jaime Reyes, I think, was really cool after Infinite Crisis, basically when he popped up, you know, when he became like the new Blue Beetle. He was really cool as part of that whole story. The issue with Jaime Reyes is I feel like in recent years, he's kind of just gotten the rebuff, right? It's just kind of like, he's a guy who's there. Thanks for watching, guys, peace. Like that's basically it. When it comes to Jaime Reyes, like you don't really get much with him. You know, like DC hasn't really pushed him all that hard. And the cool thing about this is that having him being brought in as a person who's infected by the Batman who laughs, what it does is it's really kind of Williamson's way of saying, hey, look guys, you guys have been sleeping on Jaime Reyes. Like that's really what's been going on here, right? And in reality, people are. Like people don't really understand how powerful Jaime Reyes can be. I mean, post Infinite Crisis, there were multiple circumstances where it was kind of like, hey, look, if this guy pushed his powers to the limit, right? Like if him and the Scarab push the powers to the limit and basically take all this tech and all this energy that makes up what it is that Blue Beetle can do, and then like push it to its absolute peak, the guy would be an absolute powerhouse in DC Comics. And there are times that he has been. But the fact remains that at the moment right now, like because of the nature of the Blue Beetle suit, because it's basically a high-tech suit that's used by Jaime Reyes by virtue of the Scarab that's grafted to his back, he can infiltrate virtually anything. And being able to like putting him in a circumstance where he basically becomes this kind of, you know, where Commissioner Gordon acts as a Trojan horse, which allows Jaime Reyes to basically like infiltrate the tech systems of the Fortress of Solitude and then take them all over to essentially take over Kryptonian technology, makes him like this hugely dangerous foe. Because now it's basically like Jaime Reyes amped up with like Kryptonian technology that has to face off against Batman versus Superman, and the guy's totally insane at the same time. That's kind of the crazy thing, because what this does, this is one of the crazy things about this, is that what this does, looking at the depiction of the suit as it shows up at the end of this, it doesn't really look like it's Jaime Reyes in control. The reason why I say that is in DC Comics, one of the things that they established is that the Scarab can actually seize control and totally take over absent Jaime Reyes' influence, right? So it almost becomes this kind of Bruce Banner Incredible Hulk thing, right? You know, where like the Incredible Hulk takes over and Bruce Banner can't really stop him. It's similar to that, not identical, but it's something akin to that. But the Scarab basically takes over and becomes like, it literally grows in size, it becomes bigger. It gets like these spikes and all this crazy stuff looking on his back. That's kind of how it looks at the moment, you know? Now, again, this is probably one of those circumstances where this form is achieved by the two of them working in tandem because they've both been infected, right? I mean, infected with a Joker toxin because of the fact that the Scarab is grafted to the spine of Jaime Reyes. You infect one, you infect the other, right? You can't really get away with only infecting one of them and then the other one's just kind of there. As a result of that, Batman and Superman are taken out quick, fast, and in a hurry. But being able to infiltrate Kryptonian technology in turn allows Jaime Reyes to infiltrate the rest of the world's technology, right? To infiltrate the Hall of Heroes and all that kind of stuff. And this is one of the cool things that goes on here, is because what this does is it ties into villains of the year. It ties into Scott Snyder's Justice League, because for those of you guys who are watching Scott Snyder's Justice League, you have Lex Luthor, who's basically the apex predator now, like this, you could call him a human if you want to, the way that he was originally created when the multiverse was first formed, before it was wiped away and then replaced with everything we've basically been seeing since, like, you know, the formation of DC Comics in the modern era. As a result of that, like, he's basically like a Martian Manhunter and a human being merged into one, is really what it is, right? That's how people originally were. But he's also leading his Legion of Doom, and the Legion of Doom is one of these things where it's kind of like trying to seize control, like ensure the survival of Perpetua. And so what this means, what this shows, is that the Batman Who Laughs is on a collision course with Lex Luthor's forces. Here's the question I have: is the enemy of my enemy my friend? That's my question that I'm asking here, is because if that's the case, then what I would love to see come out of this is, even if it's only for a temporary alliance, right? Like Batman, Superman, the Batman Who Laughs, and the Secret Six working together against the forces of Lex Luthor. That would be legit. Like that would be baller. Because dude, imagine, like, here's the thing. Imagine what would happen if the Batman and the Batman Who Laughs teamed up with each other. Like, imagine what that would look like. Like, nobody would stand a chance. They'd be like Super Batman, basically. It'd be Super Batman just wreaking havoc on whoever he fights. It'd be pretty cool. It'd be pretty solid. Okay, so we're picking back up again with Batman versus, not really Batman versus Superman, Batman, Superman. Essentially like the Batman Who Laughs. Now, this is awesome, right? Because in the last video we picked up with Jaime Reyes basically being infected and then using the Blue Beetle Scarab to essentially infect the Fortress of Solitude, right? And so what this does is follow up immediately after that. Now, for the most part, taking over the entire defense system of the Fortress of Solitude and using it against both Batman and Superman, for the most part, with Superman understanding how it works, initially he would begin to find a way out, right? Like that was kind of the expectation, is that he would find a way out. Batman would be a little more stuck, right? Because he doesn't really know the fortress inside and out the way that Superman does, but of course, given his ingenuity, he would ultimately find a way out as well. And so really, if it's just Jaime Reyes facing off against Batman versus Batman and Superman, eventually they would be able to overtake him, right? Just by sheer force of will or what have you. But notice this, the Batman Who Laughs, knowing what he knows about Superman, right? And knowing that Superman would keep an eye on him, you know, not really literally insofar as listening to him and making sure that he's not really making an escape or something like that, the Batman Who Laughs uses this to his advantage and just starts whispering in the ear of Superman. The funny thing about this is that what you end up getting here is the intervention of Donna Troy and Hawkman, but not in the way that you expect. Instead, they're siding with the Batman Who Laughs. And this is a crazy thing, because it's interesting in this scenario, because as best we could tell, this is actually Donna Troy from the main DC universe, right? And the reason why is because what she says, of course, kind of lashing out at Superman, saying, for everything that you've done, right? This is for Wally, this is for Dick, this is for Roy, this is Heroes in Crisis stuff. And this is one of the reasons why stories like that, you know, why we cover those events, is because it's one of those kind of stories where, yes, it can be read in isolation, but also because it would be referenced with regards to things that go on in the future. And that's exactly what's happening here. No one really knows what was going on with Wally West. When it comes to Dick Grayson, he was shot in the head by KG Beast, right? We covered the story of Batman fighting KG Beast and the reason why that happened, but Dick Grayson changed his name to Rick, and he's basically trying to live a normal life, and ultimately suffered like brain damage and like memory loss and things like that. So he's essentially out, and Roy Harper died during Heroes in Crisis. And so because of the various escapades and because of the various actions of Batman and Superman over the years, whether they intended to do good things or not, it's resulted in casualties. And one of the things that Donna Troy hits on here is that the role they play, right? Superman being this figure of hope and Batman being this dark knight, that while they are inspiring in their own way, they inspire people who are essentially ill-equipped to become superheroes to join their cause and then march off to their dooms, right? But we'll talk more about Hawkman here in a second, because what seems to be going on with him is not actually what's going on with him. And it's actually a really cool reference that Joshua Williamson is pulling out here. But again, like what we end up learning here with Commissioner Gordon really sort of, you know, speaking to these guys, is that everything that's been going on here is simply one piece of a much bigger puzzle. And we didn't really know what that puzzle was until just now. That what he basically says is, like, you know, when Superman's telling Donna Troy, like, Batman Who Laughs is going to wipe out everything on Earth, the response to Commissioner Gordon is, well, it's just a purge, is what it is. It's getting rid of the weak and only keeping those who want to see the truth, right? Who want to have their eyes opened. And so what he basically says is that, like, what he needed was an object from the dark multiverse. What he needed is what used to be the Justice League satellite from the dark multiverse of the Batman Who Laughs. And what he'd done here, this is one of the coolest things ever. What the Batman Who Laughs had done here is he had modified this satellite of the Justice League from his universe, that where we can largely assume it functioned in the same capacity as the satellite in the main DC universe, right? Insofar as it's a place of monitoring and it's basically a place to kind of ensure that things that are going on in the world can be kept track of. Not in the sense that the Justice League's spying on anybody, but in the sense that, like, if there's different crises taking place around the world, they can respond effectively, right? Kind of a safety monitoring device. That what the Batman Who Laughs had done is he had modified it in such a way, using a combination of various metals, you know, inf metal, different things like that, that what it does does is it essentially can transform an entire planet, right? It can infect an entire world. That's the idea, is to bring it here and infect the entirety of Earth all at one time. The issue was that they needed various people to open the portal, right? To get the portal to a place where it could be open. And this is one of the cool things about this, because it says, like, you know, you have these different characters that have existed, these different things, right? So you've got magic, which is covered by Shazam. You've got different characters that play different roles here. And it even references back to the events of Dark Knight's Metal. It's like the first step to getting this portal open was to basically use Superman to get someone to cross over to the other side, to the dark multiverse, which is exactly what Superman did, right? When Batman was captured by Barbados, that Superman and the various superheroes used the Tower of the Anti-Monitor and the Phantom Zone projector to get Superman over to the dark multiverse. That was the first part of opening the portal, right? And it's like all these little steps that have taken place along the way that seemed innocuous, that seemed kind of like a thing that was a good idea in the moment that you never really thought anything about, suddenly become stupendously important. And it's awesome, because what ends up happening here is, of course, Batman kind of chimes in and says, yes, I do plan for everything. I'm Batman. Of course I plan for everything, which includes somebody stealing Commissioner Gordon's old Batman armor, which again is a reference to the New 52 to DCU when Commissioner Gordon became Batman after Bruce Wayne's supposed death during Batman Endgame, right? So like all these things that have taken place over DC in the last however many years, this is awesome. I love this kind of feeling of cohesiveness, right? I love these references, these callbacks to these old stories. It's a really, really cool thing. And so of course, Batman and Superman basically engineer their escape, you know, with Batman detonating this Batman armor that Commissioner Gordon used to use, and then the two of them sort of getting out there and saying, okay, what do we do next? And so what Superman reveals here is that as part of the Fortress of Solitude, and this makes perfect sense, right? Because one of the questions to always ask here is, what would happen if somebody like Lex Luthor infiltrated the Fortress of Solitude and tried to plunder all of its secrets? And Superman basically reveals that within the Fortress of Solitude is a kind of reactor, right? A core reactor. And that if something happens, if things go south in the fortress, you know, things basically begin to go awry, that what can happen is if the reactor itself is ever in a point of danger, then essentially, or at least in danger of detonating, that everything will basically lock down in the fortress, and the fortress will sink to the bottom of the ocean, right? So nobody gets in and nobody gets out. And that's their idea here. Their idea here is, okay, the infected individuals for the most part, as they exist here, are locked within the Fortress of Solitude. So what we basically do is we initiate a countdown, we initiate a protocol whereby the entire fortress gets locked down and basically comes down here. We defeat everybody who's here, we stem the infection, and then when we're done, we basically, you know, initiate the failsafe that allows the fortress to come back up, and we basically save the day. It's a super smart idea, because what happens here is one of the funny things that goes on is the question is, okay, like Batman, can you handle your own against Donna Troy, right? Because we're gonna have to face against these guys. Can you handle your own against Donna Troy? And it's kind of funny because, you know, Superman's like, have you ever sparred with Wonder Woman? And Batman's like, yeah, man, we've sparred, and I had bruises for months. And I know she was holding back. It's cool. Like I love that little thing. It's kind of a cool thing, because then what you do is you pick up with Hawkman and you pick up with Donna Troy. This is one of the coolest things that Williamson and DC have done, is that this is not actually Hawkman from the main DC universe. This is Hawkman from Earth 3, right? From the world of the Crime Syndicate of America. It's cool to see that some of those guys are still around. I mean, not insofar as the ones that came over during Forever Evil from the New 52, but like that's still a universe that's there. There's still various superpowered beings that are there. It's cool to see that there's still some ties being maintained there, because I love the concept of Earth 3. But Batman showing up here to face off against Carter Hall as well as face off against Donna Troy, it's kind of a cool thing, right? Because Carter Hall makes references like, there's no Batman on my Earth, there was only an Owlman. And Batman's like, yeah, man, I crushed him too, right? Just like I'm gonna destroy you. And it's kind of a cool thing, because in the middle of all this, right, with this conflict kind of playing out the way it is, and really even 2-on-1 insofar as Donna Troy facing off against like Batman and, Batman facing off against Donna Troy and Hawkman is a pretty huge task, even for Batman. Then suddenly you have Supergirl who comes into the rescue, right? Supergirl is basically like, I overheard what was going on with the Fortress of Solitude, so on and so forth, and I'm here for this, right? Now, there is a tie-in, not really a tie-in, I guess it is kind of a tie-in in the Supergirl series, which we can cover if you guys want to see it, but it's basically Supergirl the Infected, and it covers like what's going on with her and how she got here and different things like that. But the idea here is it's kind of cool, because in the midst of all that, you have, of course, Batman being rescued by Supergirl, and then in turn, like, it's this attempt to basically, for Superman to speak with Jaime Reyes. And this is a very, very important thing, right? Because ever since Jaime Reyes took over the Blue Beetle from Ted Kord, right? Even before the events of Flashpoint, back during like Infinite Crisis and so on and so forth, when Ted Kord died, when you had Jaime Reyes becoming the new Blue Beetle, in a lot of ways, Jaime Reyes was kind of rejected across the board, right? By like a lot of fans who looked at him and was just like, he's not Ted Kord though, so I don't care, right? I mean, as comic book fans, we don't like it when things change, right? It's just kind of the nature of us as fans. It's always been that way. And the results of that is, in a lot of ways, Jaime Reyes was initially rejected, was initially rebuked, nuked by Blue Beetle fans. At the same time, he was a character that didn't really know how his scarab worked. He didn't really know how his powers worked. And so while I wouldn't go as far as to say he was looked at as a liability by the Justice League, he certainly wasn't looked at on the same level as Ted Kord. And so in a lot of ways, it was just kind of like, what's this guy's place in the entirety of the DC universe? What's the point of Jaime Reyes as Blue Beetle? And it's kind of been this thing that's been holding over his head for eons, right? It's always kind of been that way. And so it's an interesting scenario because the response to Superman is, we don't just see you as a weapon. You're a member of the team. You're a member of the Justice League, right? You know, if we've ever done anything that led you to believe that wasn't the case, then I'm sorry about that. It was never our intention to do that. And so it's cool because it's kind of like, hey, look, man, like you're not as far out there and left out in the cold as you believe you are. But remember, the nature of the infection of the Batman Who Laughs is to twist your perspective of the world, right? To twist it inside out. It's like having anxiety, right? Anxiety and depression. It's to twist it inside out, screw up your perspective so that nothing that you see is actually the way that it is, and then in turn send you forward out into the world. And so it's kind of interesting because in the middle of all that, the concentration kind of breaks, right? You have Donna who shows up out of nowhere, basically ends up subduing Superman, which breaks the kind of connection he had with Jaime Reyes. Jaime Reyes reverts back into his scarab form when the infection takes hold again, at least over the suit anyway. And then in turn, you have like this Batarang, you know, this Superman Batarang that's thrown and is designed to hit Superman, only for Supergirl to jump in the way and catch it. And this is a crazy thing because it's one of these scenarios where if you're looking at the story, like if you're reading each thing as opposed to skimming, then like you would know exactly what's going to happen. Because one of the things Commissioner Gordon had said was when he had the Superman Batarang, he said this was specifically designed to pierce that Kryptonian skin of yours. And so essentially what happened when Supergirl caught it is it pierced her skin and it infected Supergirl. Supergirl is now infected with the Shazam Who Laughs toxin. In addition to that, you have the arrival of Shazam, you have the arrival of all these various infected heroes who show up. I just want to say here, right? Because one, you've got John Constantine, who's an infected member of the Batman Who Laughs family, right? He's one of the Secret Six. I prefer to think of it as like the Justice League Who Laughs, which is basically what it is. It's like their own little version of the Justice League, but you've literally got Shazam, Hawkman, John Constantine, you've got Donna Troy, you've got Blue Beetle, and you've got Supergirl. Supergirl looks amazing, dude. Like her design, like when she's infected, dude, it looks awesome, man. Like it looks really, really good. I think it's one of the coolest, the coolest depictions of a character, right? Because she just looks wicked, right? She almost looks like a combination between like Crush, which is the daughter, I think the daughter of Lobo, and like the Joker, right? It's a really cool concept, and I really love the way that it looks. But yes, essentially, the Secret Six is now formed. The satellite is brought in through the portal because the Secret Six have formed and opened the satellite. And basically, the Batman Who Laughs is in a position to infect the entire world. Okay, we are getting back into Supergirl Infected, which is to say Supergirl who is infected, like the Supergirl Who Laughs versus Batman and Superman. This is kind of nuts. But first things first, I do want to let you guys know that we have been dumping a whole lot of full stories recently, like making like mega full stories and different things like that. We did a whole bunch of full story videos with the individual story arcs from Green Lantern, but I want to start ramping up and covering Green Lantern again. So what we're going to do here is in the next couple days, we're going to take all the full stories we've done and combine them into like a mega full story. The people on Patreon already have it. They got it a few days early, but it's basically going to be like this 9-hour Green Lantern video. It's the longest full story video we've done. I'm curious to see how people respond to 9 hours. Like what I want to do, I want to max out the YouTube upload, right? The most you can upload to YouTube is 128 gigabytes. I want to see if we can do that. Like I want to see if we can like exceed that. I feel like it would end up being like a 15-hour long video, but I'm curious if you guys are going to watch 9 hours of Green Lantern. It's kind of nuts, right? Like that's an insane amount of content. But yeah, so getting into this, in the last video, we basically talked about how the Supergirl, how Supergirl herself had actually intercepted a Batarang that was meant for Superman to turn him into the Superman Who Laughs, and the result was that she was infected instead. This is kind of cool, right? Because this feels a lot, I don't know how many of you guys remember this far back, but it feels a lot like the Red Lantern Supergirl, and DC does that, right? You know, a little bit of exposition here, a little bit of explanation. DC does that with Supergirl. Kara Zor-El is one of these characters where she's been popular, but only under certain circumstances, right? The original run of her character was incredibly popular, right? Like the original Supergirl who was a backup feature in the Action comic stories, and then eventually got her own solo feature in the Adventure comic stories. She was really, really popular, right? But that was all before Crisis on Infinite Earths. The issue was that after Crisis happened, Superman went back to being the status quo of the last survivor of Krypton, right? And he couldn't be the last survivor of Krypton, like the last son of Krypton, if there was like another Kryptonian out there. So they ended up kind of getting like this weird other dimensional version, some kind of shape-shifting, manifesting thing that basically became the new Supergirl. It wasn't really the same. And then eventually Kara Zor-El returned when DC was like, whatever, just bring her back, who cares? And fans enjoyed it. But it's one of these things where like people don't really read her stories all the time. But if it's something kind of kooky and exotic that happens to her, like she becomes a Red Lantern or becomes the Supergirl who laughs, then people are really interested, right? And a lot of that's rooted back to the fact that during the Crisis on Infinite Earth story, she was more powerful than Superman, right? It was one of those things that DC had kind of hit on periodically for a while and then basically confirmed during the Crisis story. But this basically picks up with her kind of looking around after she's become the Supergirl who laughs, and then just sort of kind of taking on this stance of like, she's truly going to fix the world and she's truly going to make the world a better place. Now, here's the thing. Jodie Houser's writing sometimes is really, really good. And other times it's kind of like, I'm not really sure where she's going with this. But I do love what she's doing here, right? Because when it comes to the various Kryptonians that exist in DC Comics, they always pull their punches, right? We've seen that happen multiple times, and it's been confirmed multiple times over the course of DC Comics that Superman pulls his punches. That if we saw Superman fight like outright with all the strength that he potentially has, he could potentially destroy the world, right? The cool thing about this is that her showing up and basically doing things like rescuing a bus and so on and so forth, one of the things that you kind of notice here is that she's kind of become the darker version of herself. Not really evil, but almost really just kind of like obsessed with herself insofar as like, I'm the most important thing ever. And this manifests in the form of like, yes, this bus is saved, but instead of like tending to the passengers and doing what we would expect her to do, which is to say, is anybody okay? Is everybody all right? Instead, she's just like, you're welcome. I've done a fine job. And she like pats herself on the back and then goes about her business and does her thing. And that's the kind of crazy situation, is because she immediately goes after the bus driver, right? And the response here is like, these kids almost died, and it was almost because of you, right? There's no questions of like, what happened here? Did a tire blow out? Like were you drinking on the job? Like, none of those questions were asked. It's immediately the assumption that like, this guy screwed up and like, he now has to pay the price, right? It's a very heavy-handed approach, but it's almost kind of a criticism of like, I know what's right 100% of the time, right? Kind of adopted that mentality. What is it? Philip DeFranco said, why be informed when you have your opinion? It's that kind of concept sort of thrown into the comic insofar as she's just sort of she's carried away with herself. Now, the good thing about this is that Jodie Houser strikes a balance. It'd be very, very easy to kind of go down like the hardcore political scene, but we get just enough to where it's like, okay, so she's basically become super arrogant and super self-obsessed, but not so much where it's like, all right, now I'm reading a political message. If it's done right, political messages can be amazing. A really good example of that, God Loves, Man Kills. If it's not really good, well, then you basically get the first 2 years of Marvel after All New, All Different. So, the cool thing about this is that, of course, Superman shows up here, and this is where things begin to shift. Because again, for anybody who'd been reading Supergirl for any real measure of time, the first thing they'll tell you is that during the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths, she was the last one standing, right? All the versions of Superman, including Superboy Prime, all those guys had fallen, and she was the only one left who was powerful enough to do really any kind of damage or really even stand a chance against the Anti-Monitor. Now, she didn't save everything, right? That all basically came down to the Spectre, but at the end of the day, she basically outlasted everybody else. And people kind of look to that as the perspective of she's stronger than Superman. When you take that and you couple it with a lot of the things we've seen confirmed along the way, between the time that she reappeared, after Crisis on Infinite Earths, going into like New 52 and DC Universe Rebirth and that kind of a thing, that she's just this really heavy hitter. And that's kind of what goes on here, is because she basically tells Superman, like, you're a half measure, right? Like, you could fix the world. You could punish the criminals. Like, you could go to all these people who are committing all these crimes and say, you're done now. And the response of Superman is, but that's not why I'm here. And that's the beauty behind the character of Superman, right? That's why Superman and Batman are such incredibly amazing superheroes, is because what you end up having here is a scenario where Superman's like, yeah, I mean, I could do that, right? But if he did, he'd become no different than like the crime syndicate from Earth 3. He would bend the world to his whim, right? It would be injustice Superman. We've seen that play out. Now, ultimately, it's this idea that like Supergirl kind of looks at him as a guy who pulls his punches. And the result is that she absolutely thrashes Superman. Now, she doesn't beat him within an inch of his life or anything like that, but it's made clear in no uncertain terms that she's not pulling punches. And if she chose to, she could absolutely pummel him. And that's kind of a big moment here. It's a pretty significant thing, right? Because it really kind of ties into the historical aspect that we've seen with her character, that she's more powerful than Superman. And so after he basically ends up falling at the hands of Supergirl, then you have Batman who shows up. And this is really like shady moment here, right? Like, a Supergirl being like shady as hell, because like she makes this comment to him, where he's like, she's like, I'm not one of your teenagers you can control. How many of those kids have you gotten killed? And it's like, dang, man, like, dude, that's cutting deep. Drawn blood, son. That's pretty brutal. But Batman basically calls it for what it is. You're an impetulant child, right? Like, you're an impetulant child with no patience who's basically been given these godlike powers and doesn't know how to control them. Superman sees you as his cousin, and that's nice and that's cute. I see you for what you are, a danger and a threat. No one knows what direction you're going to go in, if you're going to snap and just destroy everybody. And to a degree, that's kind of true, right? Superman has had decades to prove himself, to show what he is and what he's about. Supergirl is still relatively new on the scene. She's not brand new, right? She didn't show up in like 3 years ago or anything like that, but she certainly hasn't had as much time to earn the trust of Batman in the way that Superman has. And even with Superman, it took a long time, right? Batman doesn't really trust anybody. And so as a result of that, Supergirl basically immediately targets Batman, right? She takes out the Batwing, sends that flying down to the ground, rips the door off, and is like still hiding behind your toys. You know what that reminds me of? I don't know how many of you guys remember it, but it reminds me of Original Sin, right? When basically there was this story where you ended up finding out that Bruce Banner believed that Tony Stark was the one responsible for him becoming the Incredible Hulk in the first place. And so the Hulk manifests and kind of goes on this warpath, and like Iron Man is just like fleeing for his life, right? Like he's just like jumping from armor to armor, and then eventually gets his hands on the Hulkbuster armor, and the Incredible Hulk comes walking into the room, and he's like, always the optimist, Tony, as if you really had a chance with that suit of armor anyway, and then basically crushes the armor around Iron Man, right? It's one of the coolest moments ever. We covered that in Original Sin, and you'll find that here on the channel. I think it's actually, I don't remember if we covered it individually or if we covered it as part of the whole event, but you'll find that in the full story that you'll find down in the description. But it's kind of a cool little thing, because Batman's response is like, yeah, I don't trust you. Like, I don't know who you are. Like, you're just some kind of unknown thing that's out there. And her response is like, I could kill you if I wanted to, but I'm not, because he won't let me. Of course, her speaking about the Batman who laughs, he has his own plan for you. And so as a result, she basically dismisses him, throws him away, Superman rescues him, and then she takes off. And it's kind of a cool moment there, because what this does is it basically branches off into her own individual comic, right? It kind of continues on along the Supergirl plot threads, and will probably ultimately wrap back around into the actual Batman versus Superman line of stories at the moment. But it's a great little thing here, because what you get is essentially this ridiculously, just not really even overpowered, so much as Supergirl in her raw form, when she's not pulling any punches, when she's not holding back, and when she really is taking on Batman and Superman with the full length of her abilities. The only reason why she didn't kill these guys is because she chose not to, because I would submit here that if Supergirl so wanted to choose, like if she so chose to do it, she could kill Superman. It wouldn't be an easy thing, right? She's not gonna like punch him in the head and like shake his brain and kill him, right? It's not gonna go down that fast, but she could beat him to death, and it'd be kind of a cool thing. Like it'd be interesting to see like this knockdown, drag out fight between Supergirl and Superman in terms of who would actually win here. I'm kind of curious. Okay, so we are picking up with the conclusion of Batman Superman number 5. And for those of you guys who have been following along with this, you guys are aware that what's been going on here is the Batman Who Laughs kind of had this grand plan, right? This great big huge grand scheme. And the idea is that it originated really arriving on Earth during the events of the Dark Knight's Metal storyline. Now, some people had asked, and I'd seen this in the comments, some people had thought the Batman Who Laughs had been killed during the events of Dark Knight's Metal. And the reality is that he hadn't, right? The Batman Who Laughs actually just kind of skirted around a little bit. He was part of the Immortal Men, I think it was, for a little while, although nothing really significant was done with him. I think he just kind of appeared like once in the first issue. It wasn't really until we got to the Batman story, that we basically saw, this whole depiction of the Batman Who Laughs plan. But the idea is that this plan has really been going on for quite some time. And so the indication here is that the actions of Barbados and all those guys during Dark Knight's Metal was really more of something they were doing, and the Batman Who Laughs was forming his own scheme along the way. But what he had done, at least what we knew about him, is that in his own universe, when he had destroyed all the various superheroes, including the Justice League and Superman and so on and so forth, that what he had intended to do was to basically repurpose the Watchtower, the Justice League Watchtower in his own universe, so that he could basically spread his influence throughout any world that he arrives in. And that's what he's been doing here, right? The whole idea was to basically create a circumstance whereby the entire Kryptonian system could be manipulated by Jaime Reyes due to his ability to tap into technology, and then with the other members of the Infected, with Jim Gordon and those various characters, they could essentially open a portal to the Dark Multiverse, or to the universe of the Batman Who Laughs, and then bring the Justice League Watchtower through and infect the entire Earth in one fell swoop. That's really what he's been shooting to do the entire time. And at the end of the last issue, they succeeded in pulling the Watchtower through. Now remember, the Batman Who Laughs is currently held in prison below the Hall of Justice, and he's been there since the Batman story, right? Even when this story first picked up, he's been there the entire time. But one of the things that goes on is that the infection that he's basically spread to Supergirl, to Donna Troy, to Hawkman, and these various characters, is that it allows him to communicate with them on a frequency that only they can hear. Presumably this was developed by the Batman Who Laughs in order to ensure that Superman couldn't overhear. But it's kind of funny funny here because when this goes down, Batman and Superman still play their roles. And in fact, Williamson does a really good job of explaining to us why it is that they do what they do and how they're functioning this way. But what they end up doing is Superman initially tries to talk them down. Now, the reality of this is that on the surface, they seem too far gone, right? They seem too far to be able to talk back into reason. That's just not really the case anymore. Instead, it's just kind of like, these guys are screwed and like there's no way to get them back. That's kind of the indication that's put on here. But the reality is that where some of the bugs and the various organisms that exist inside Superman's Fortress of Solitude are basically brought into this location, at the end of the day, they're able to kind of offer some measure of resistance, but the main focus is the Watchtower itself. Now, of course, Superman ends up traveling to the Watchtower, and Batman's basically facing off against a couple forces along the way. The problem with this, and this is where things really get hairy, is that when Superman actually enters the Watchtower, then he sees the full gravity of what's going on. The fact that the entire Justice League from the Batman Who Laughs universe has been killed, and then he turns around and of course he sees the bodies of himself as well as Lois Lane and Jonathan Kent. Now, this is where things get really screwed up, right? Because if you guys recall, during the origin story of the Batman Who Laughs, one of the things that he had done is where the Joker had died, and ultimately Bruce Wayne ingested this super potent toxin that turned him into the Batman Who Laughs, that when he had basically traveled and kind of brought Superman in, tricked him into being there, that Superman and Jonathan were exposed to black kryptonite, which basically twisted them up, screwed them up, and they ended up being the ones to kill Lois Lane, presumably beating her to death. And then they themselves seemed to succumb to kryptonite. Now, I don't think it's explicitly stated that they ended up dying from black kryptonite exposure, but at this point, I don't know what else would have killed them. And so as a result of that, it's really cool because then Shazam and Supergirl show up on the scene, and you get to see something that you don't really get to see all that often, where Shazam sort of taunts Superman, and says, oh yeah, man, it was bad that happened, but I guess you were just too weak in your universe, and kind of giving him a hard time, making fun of him, basically, calling him pathetic and so on and so forth. And even where Supergirl joins in and says, yeah, like, I'm sorry about your loss, even if it is your family from another world, but this basically just shows how outmatched you are, that you would be happier if you joined us, different things like that. Superman flips out. He absolutely lashes out. And again, you don't get to see that you don't get to see this very often, but it is cool to see when it does happen because Supergirl is totally taken by surprise. She's like, holy crap, I didn't even know this was coming. Now, this is one of those things that fans really point to when they talk about the strength differences between Superman and Supergirl, because traditionally, like one of the things we mentioned in the previous video is that historically, Supergirl's always been shown to be stronger and more powerful than Superman. But a lot of you guys also made a really, really good point when what you said was that oftentimes at the same time, to kind of accompany that, Supergirl's usually shown to be more reckless. And so because of that, she doesn't really hold back in the same way Superman does. And so the indication that Superman could actually be, and seems to be possibly more powerful than Supergirl, he just holds back his strength a lot more. And it kind of makes sense, right? Lex Luthor and Superman get into a knockdown, drag out fight, and he just punches Lex Luthor with all his strength. Well, he's gonna punch him into oblivion. Falcon punch! Like, that's basically what it's gonna end up turning into. Just punching the absolute hell out of him. And so because that, Superman usually holds back. But in this instance, he doesn't really have to because both Supergirl and Shazam can take it. The other part of this is very quick thinking on his behalf, right? Shazam trying to call down his thunder, Superman stepping out of the way, it ultimately ends up hitting Supergirl. It's cool to see these small little moments go down, but Superman is highly pissed off. And because of that, it's one of these things where he's at a precipice where he could snap. And that's really what the Batman Who Laughs has been looking for, to push Superman to a position where he can snap, right? Where he can break. Because if he can break, then he can be recreated, right? He can be put back together in a different way, presumably falling down that darker path. Now, for Batman himself, facing off against Jaime Reyes, of course, it's Batman, right? So he's always quick thinking on the spot. And so what he does is he looks at Jaime and he says, technically, your scarab can't really be infected, but you can, which means if you're infected, your scarab's not. So literally reaching into Jaime, yanking the scarab off and putting it on himself, basically he has all the powers of the Blue Beetle now. But it does allow him to basically take back control of the Fortress of Solitude, which Jaime Reyes has been controlling this entire time. And so from there, he ends up basically temporarily knocking out Commissioner Gordon and then starts talking to Superman. And this is where Williamson basically makes this really, really good point in terms of why they don't fall down the path of becoming bad guys. Because Batman starts to basically speak with Superman and saying, look, I get that you're angry. And so as a result of that, Batman kind of talks him down and says, look, you've got to chill, you've got to relax. If we end up becoming like the villains that we're facing, we'll be better villains than they ever were. The other part of this, and the reason why these stories work so well, is because Batman basically makes this statement, right? Superman always told Batman that you always worry too much. But the response of Batman is, I never really worry. Like, I've never really worried about things because I trust you. And that's a very important thing, right? Because what it shows is that Batman recognizes the strength of Superman, not insofar that Superman can punch really hard and fly fast. Those are things that Batman, of course, recognizes, but it's the strength of Superman's character. It's the fact that Superman is not so easily corrupted. And again, with the Batman Who Laughs universe, it's not only the Batman Who Laughs basically talked Superman into killing his family and he was just easily manipulated. They literally had to use kryptonite in order to turn Superman in that way, right? So Superman's almost this incorruptible thing. That's the whole entire nature behind Doomsday Clock, right? Superman is incorruptible. He can't be screwed up that way. And Justice kind of flies in the face of that, but it's Injustice. It's different. It's different. It's not the same thing. And so as a result of that, of course, the Watchtower of the Batman Who Laughs is basically pushed into the sun and destroyed. And then in turn, the response of Batman and Superman is to talk to Commissioner Gordon. And that's the important thing to bear in mind here, is that when Batman was talking to Superman and essentially talking him down, what he told him is, you have to let Supergirl and Shazam go because you chasing after them is a distraction. That's basically what that is. Don't let them distract you in that way. Let them go off and do their thing. We have to destroy this Watchtower. But when they're talking to Commissioner Gordon, it's basically saying, hey, look, there's a way to bring you guys back. We'll figure out what it is. We'll turn everybody back to the way they were. So if you really believe this is a permanent thing and you've somehow officially won, then please understand that's not the case. And that's when he chimes in and says, but where do you think your friends are going though? And of course, that's when we end up realizing that in reality, the Batman Who Laughs kind of saw this coming. Now, again, that's where things sort of wear thin. And that's why I say the nature of Batman really kind of wears thin, right? Because if you take everything that Batman does and you apply it to a different character, then suddenly you start to realize how redundant Batman is. And it's one of these things where it's like, well, the Batman Who Laughs always saw this coming. He had this all planned out the entire time. And so because of that, he was able to overcome whatever plan Batman had. It's one of those funny things, Batman does the exact same thing. He's written the exact same way. Batman is always like, he always comes out on top. And that you're basically seeing the nature of Batman thrown onto a different character. So I would submit, if what's going on with the Batman Who Laughs really kind of bores you, imagine what it's like reading Batman all the time. It's pretty much the exact same thing. The difference is that his stories are just told differently. But it's kind of cool here because when they get down there, of course, what they end up realizing is they were played the entire time. And this entire scheme was never expected to succeed. The scheme of like the satellite being pulled through and all that kind of stuff, there was no expectation it was actually going to work, right? Because if it was, why leave it to some group like the Secret Six, which could easily and most likely be overtaken by Batman and Superman? So the whole purpose behind what it was that Batman Who Laughs wanted to do was essentially instigate this entire circumstance where it looked like things were going to pop off, Batman and Superman were going to respond, they were going to get into a great big huge fight, and knowing how things were going to go down, they were going to have to basically let some of the members escape and do whatever it is that they were going to do in order to stop the Watchtower from basically transforming the entire world into a world of people who laugh. And so in doing that, it left the door open for Shazam and Supergirl to take off and to basically free the Batman Who Laughs. And so now he's kind of out of his cell and back into things again. And so what this does is it basically, really forces Batman and Superman to come to the realization that keeping everything that was going on to themselves and certainly not bringing in Wonder Woman, who's part of the Trinity, was the wrong mistake to make. And of course, she's going to be pissed. But everything else that goes on with the Batman Who Laughs is actually followed in the Batman Who Laughs and the Infected, You're the Villain, Hell Arisen, right? So it follows their own individual escapades over there. In my mind, the story's cool, but the whole concept of the Batman Who Laughs is kind of starting to wear thin. And it's really just kind of the same thing all the time, right? Like, there's a circumstance that unfolds, and somehow the Batman Who Laughs was always able to prepare for a circumstance that he didn't know was coming, right? It's like Batman. Batman prepares for things even if he doesn't know what's going to happen, right? So he prepares for unknown factors, which seem impossible, but when you're Batman or the Batman Who Laughs, you have the power of plot armor. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys want to see my uncensored videos, my versus videos, and all my early access videos, make sure you guys go over to patreon.com/Comics Explained. And if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace. We've got some new patrons in our top tiers over on patreon.com/Comics Explained. I want to give a shout out to Jason C, Austin S, Austin H, Phillip, and Austin B, as well as Steven Z, Eagle F, Joey M, and Jeff R, as well as Genosis 916. As always, we just usually keep the last name to an initial. It helps you guys to maintain your anonymity. Some of you guys have expressed concern about having like your first and last name thrown out there for the world to see. I do not blame you. For you guys who have joined up as part of our Patreon tiers that are eligible for Rob Corps Honor Guard rings, those whose rings have been sent out, you should already have them. If you're a new person who just joined up and you've been part of this tier for a month, your ring will be mailed out to you. So I want to say thank you guys for being patrons.